no one knows who invented how to, musical saw. It was, as a matter of fact, the idea of creating spring steel, which is what makes a musical saw musical, it's the steel, that type of steel wasn't invented until about 100 years ago, in the early 1900s, when the Industrial Revolution came to a place where they could develop that kind of steel to use for tools. So at that same time, the people that were using a lot of saws were, of course, loggers. And there were logging camps all over the U.S. where they were taking down all of these beautiful trees that were a part of this country's heritage. And one of the things that would happen around campfires in the evening that loggers would do to the new loggers that would come into the camp to kind of frighten them, to keep, it was a joke, really, but they would tell ghost stories about creatures in the woods. And for all any new loggers, for all anybody knew, maybe these were actually real creatures. And so they'd sit around campfires, and I believe loggers, because they were dealing with spring steel in the saws that they use, it's thought, actually, not just me, but I believe firmly, because no one knows who invented saw playing, that loggers were some of the first people to understand that spring steel could be used to create music. And these stories were kind of ancient horror stories about awful creatures that they found. As a matter of fact, there was a man who went around the country from logging camp to logging camp, and he collected stories from logging camps all over the United States, and he wrote a book called The Fearsome Creatures of the Lumber Woods. And I have a copy of the book. And in the book is a story that my grandfather used to tell me about a creature that used to inhabit the logging camps, or the woods in northern Wisconsin, where my grandfather settled in this little town called Rhinelander. And I remember as a child always asking, because it was such a fascinating story, my grandfather got irritated with me because I kept asking him to tell me the story about the Hodag. And the Hodag was one of these creatures that, it was just a fantasy creature, but it was a horror story that loggers used and shared around campfires.
What's a Hodag?
Well, a Hodag there's a couple different stories about Hodags, and in the book is one story. My grandfather told me another story that was slightly different, but it was said that the oxen that they used to pull giant logs out of the woods were savagely beaten by the drivers of these animals. So they'd whip them to get them to do their labor. And it was, awful labor for these creatures to have to go through. So they beat them so badly that a spirit of one of those oxen developed unnatural characteristics. So it got savage-looking fangs and teeth and horns on its body that looked more like what you'd see on an iguana, going down the center of its back and along a long tail like an iguana. Think of like an oxen and an iguana cross. So the size of an ox, but an iguana with horns, except it had horns, had huge fangs, big claws, horns going all the way down its back and down its tail. And so the story was to frighten, of course, new loggers, but I mean, as a child, I was just fascinated by the fact that, there might, it scared me, and I wondered if there were scary creatures that I should be worried about in the woods. So,
wow, thank you.
Well, I started on the street about 40 years ago. A couple of guys came up to me and wanted me to play with them in a band. And I was fingerpicking back then blues, getting into fingerpicking blues, which I had been. But there was a fiddle player and a flat picking guitar player, and they wanted to do more bluegrass and fiddle tunes kind of stuff. And I didn't know how to play that style. So we were in a little larger ensemble that we blended into called the Music Circus, and they decided they wanted to, the mandolin player had a washboard, and he said, why don't you play this? And it had a single Campbell's soup can on the side of it. And by the end of the day, I had played it so I mean, I didn't know what I was doing, but while I was playing it, the Campbell soup can broke off. So I felt terrible. And that made me want to get involved with making my own washboard. And because I was a collector of stuff, like you can see here that I have available, and I was collecting old music on 78 RPM records, I knew that there were some washboard players that had all kinds of crazy stuff on their washboards, and I had collected old records with featuring those guys, and I'd seen pictures of them. Excuse me. So I started collecting weird sound effects and sounds that I could include on my own washboard. So like on this one, the first sound effect I got was from that mandolin player who gave me this homemade 3-tone train whistle that just sounds gorgeous. And we were playing a lot of train songs, so you know, I loved having a train sound to play. And then there's a very famous washboard player by the name of Hezzy, and he was in a little jazz style band called the Hoosier Hotshots, and he was also a fabulous slide whistle player.
Oh my goodness.
So I found the slide whistle, and I included the slide whistle on my washboard. And then kids, you know, we were playing music for mostly adults, and we didn't really have much available for kids, but I found a sound effect kind of that had a real appeal to little kids, so I added it to my washboard, this siren whistle.
Oh, I remember those.
Kids love the sound of it. It sounds like the you know, the way that the Roadrunner took off when the coyote was after him. You know. So then I found a company that actually made true train whistle tones in train whistles, in brass and both aluminum and brass, and the aluminum one is a little easier to blow into, so I included this aluminum one on my washboard. And so you hear the difference?
Wow.
So you can do a song with two trains.
Oh no! Yeah.
Heading on the tracks in the same direction, in opposite directions, you know, ready to crash.
Oh, can you do the Crash of Old 99? I love that song.
The record for the old 99.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I found this, and this is another thing that I added, and I've had for years and years, and then I lost the place that was carrying them, stopped carrying them, but I just recently found a place that started carrying these little bubble bears. And you take the lid off his hat and you squeeze his belly and the wand comes out. Oops, give me some juice now. Come on, Bubble Bear, don't fail me. We're on the film here.
He's camera shy.
So you can do, you know, one-handed bubbles for the kids.
That's amazing. Oh.
So I included him on my latest, this is my latest rebuild of my washboard that I wanted to get together before the fair.
Okay, he just sits right down there.
So then I also found this effect to go with the eyes.
Ooh. What does that do? Oh, I see the eyebrows.
Yeah,
oh my gosh.
The little eyebrow thing.
That's awesome. I love it. And it's got fangs. Where did this plate come from? It looks old.
Yeah, it's I think it's a demon god mask. Wow. It's made out of brass, and it's inset with little blue and red stones.
Did you add the lights then?
Yeah, I added the lights.
Oh, that's
and
cool.
then up here, where I normally put a harmonica, here, let me grab a harmonica, I'll show you. I invented this.
And you've got is that a symbol on the front?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then what's down here?
These are wood blocks. Here, let me get, I'll grab my, where did I put that?
Looks like a motorcycle engine.
Here, let me turn on some lights. Well, here, I'll leave the lights off for a minute, but just so you can get some images. So I wear thimbles on my fingers.
Okay.
6 thimbles.
6 thimbles?
Yeah, on my first, my index and my middle and my ring finger.
Okay.
So, and I collect old thimbles to use for that purpose.
Do you have a preference of style?
They're
or
really hard to
metal?
find. Yeah, the thimbles that I use for my fingers are really hard to find. It's a certain style thimble, and I'm trying to get 6. I've been looking for decades to find 6 matching ones. They're a little hard to see, but here, I'll show you what I do a little bit on the washboard. And so I invented this little thing up here that has these 5 bells. And I found an old vacuum cleaner part that was for attaching vacuum cleaner attachments, and I realized that I could slide a harmonica into this vacuum cleaner section, and I call this my vacuum vasonica.
Vacuum Vasonica.
And I lost a thimble.
Oh,
I
no.
better turn on a light so I can see where my. What I tried to do is illuminate them. So this one just has the little eyes of the Day of the Dead board that change colors,
Oh, wow.
and it's got little old clock gongs.
Oh, wow.
And a nice old ship's bell on this one. A little series of
Cowbell. Wow.
Then I've got this one over here.
Does it have a title?
Well, I just call it my Day of the Dead board because I included a lot of, scary Day of the Dead kind of sugar skulls. They're not really scary, but. And then this one I just called Freedom because I wanted to use this this image of this set of lettering to include. Uh-oh, what happened? Oh, that's that one. Okay. So, God, I just put this together.
Oh, wow.
So, one of the lights is here. I'll turn it to the side. You can see lights up the little bell up here. And I call this I did the same thing with this one. I used an old baritone marching band bell, and then I added parts from a vacuum cleaner, so I call it my vacuumphonica.
Vacuumphonica.
So when you put a harmonica in here with this bigger bell, you get a little more bassy tone, and the one over there with the multiple small bells, you get a little sharper tone on the harmonica.
Beautiful.
And then, just again, a series of, here, let me grab some out of here. A record set box. So, you've got a.
Is that the top of a prayer wheel?
This? No, these were 2 small bells that you hang on a leather thong and you cling together.
Oh.
And then these were bike bells that I put custom brass phone bells on. This is an old cowbell. This is actually quite valuable. I didn't know that when I found it and stuck it on there. And then I looked it up.
Zill bell? Is that a special kind of bell?
What's that?
A zill bell?
Yeah, it's made by a company that makes there's a popular they made really popular percussion devices called Zildjian. So
Oh, yeah.
they make cymbals.
Yeah.
Very, very expensive cymbals.
Sure. Yeah, you see them in rock bands, Zildjian, all the time.
Yeah. Hold on, I'll grab something. Bang on them with. So.
And they can experiment how the different materials make different sounds.
Right. So with the wood on these gongs, and they can explore sound.
That's beautiful.
You know, with no rules or no regulations, no mom.
No instructions.
Right. As a matter of fact, the first time I brought them last year, I remember one mom saying, "No, don't touch," and I said, "No, do touch." And all it took was one child to start playing with the washboards, and they were mobbed the entire time I was there last time.
Well, I can see why. Yeah, I think heck, I'm not a child and I want to sit and play with it all day now.
Right, even big kids were enjoying these things. So, and I put together this little series of urinals. I call it my bedpan or my urinal bongos.
These are all antique urinals?
Yes. Then I realized they had a little scale to them, so da 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 da. So that's the bathroom scale.
Oh, the bathroom scale.
In the key of P.
In the key of P. Nice. Did you build that?
Yeah. So then the kids love playing with that, and the big kids especially, because they know what that's all about. One of the things that I get invited, and I have been for years and years, to do at events like this is to perform on my guitar or on my musical saw. But when I realized that children would enjoy playing with something like my washboard, what I did, I had extra parts for building washboards in my basement, and I started making them for children. And when I started building these for children, I asked folks if they wouldn't mind when they invited me to perform if I brought my gadgets to these events. And most of these events are geared toward big kids, you know, it's all big kid fun, mostly.
Like what kind of events?
Well, you know, any of these bigger festival events, you know, there's, you know, you can hear the music in the background.
Yeah.
It's not really geared toward kids.
Sure.
And I've always been, like, from the very beginning of playing washboard, was concerned about the fact that we should offer something for these little kids to kind of enjoy, you know, so that's why I added
to help bring them into the experience.
Yeah, the funny sounds on my washboard and the bubbles on my washboard. And I was the first one at the Pike Place Market. I went out to one of these magic shops that was in the Seattle area, and I found those long balloons that you can twist into animals. And I was the guy who started twisting animals for kids on the street at the Pike Place Market. And that whole thing has turned into a cottage industry now.
Wow.
There are people who do nothing but that. But I was the first guy who was doing that for kids, just giving them to kids because it was something nice for them to remember the experience of coming and enjoying our music. So I started bringing these to events, and my gadgets, I call them gadgets, they've overshadowed almost what I do. They've become an instant sort of success story where I've worked decades to build up my own personal, promo, if you will, for my guitar playing and my saw playing and what I do when I perform music at people. These things that I create, these toys for children to play with, it's been an instantaneous thing. They've been accepted not only by little kids who walk up to them and want to bang on the cymbal and check out the sounds that are on there, but even grown-ups, big kids have enjoyed playing with these things. So I get invited now just to bring my toys for kids to play with. Like at the Oregon Country Fair this year, they've invited me just to bring my gadgets, not to play music at people, but to bring toys so people can entertain themselves.
How cool is that?
Yeah.
And then, and you're gonna bring the bedpan urine or
absolutely, yes.
bathroom scale too?
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, thank you.